firearms are the #1 killer of children and teens in the United States, which is horrific. More than motor vehicle accidents, more than drug overdoses, it's guns. And like I said, it's not just school shootings. It's stolen firearms being used in crimes, and suicide by firearm, and accidental shootings by young kids. And those things are all preventable with safe gun storage. So that's the good thing, is that these things can be stopped. So talking about accidental shootings, basically, accidental shootings are when normally a child gains access to a firearm and accidentally fires it. And in 2024, 125 children have been injured in accidental shootings and 71 children have been killed. On March 28th, 2024, a 3-year-old boy gained access to his father's handgun, which had been left under the sofa, and accidentally shot and killed himself. And on April 6th, much in the same manner, a 3-year-old girl did essentially the same thing. Her father's gun was in the top of a dresser in their home. So, as you can see here, 76% of unintentional shootings are committed with guns left unsecured in the home. So it's not guns in the home, it's unsecured firearms. 85% of firearm deaths in children 0 to 12 and 39% in children 13 to 17 occur in the home. But households that lock up firearms and ammunition see up to 85% fewer accidental injuries among minors, which is just an incredible decrease in the rate of violence. Now, Everytown Research did a database summary of unintentional shootings by minors from 2015 to 2022. And you can see the statistics up here. I don't have to read them out to you. You can all read. 1,083 children killed, almost an average of almost one accidental shooting per day, where 70% happen in or around the home. But states with stricter laws regulating children's access to firearms have significantly lower rates of accidental shootings by minors. So, precisely speaking, states that have laws that hold firearm owners responsible when children access their firearms have 34% lower rates of unintentional shootings when compared to states that don't have any child access prevention laws. These rates are 39% lower in states with laws that apply when children are likely to access firearms, and 78% lower in states that mandate secure storage when a firearm is not in the owner's direct possession. So secure storage really does save lives and really does prevent these accidental shootings. Now, there are some people that argue that training your children is enough, and as long as your children know not to go near a gun, that's enough to keep them safe, but it's not. And the Journal of Developmental and Behavioral Pediatrics did a study on this. So 34 children between the ages of 4 to 7 underwent a week-long firearm safety training program, and a control group of 36 children did not. So after the program was finished, all the children were paired up and monitored playing in an environment in which they had access to, obviously, an unloaded semi-automatic pistol. 53% of the pairs of children played with the gun, and there was no discernible difference in gunplay behavior between the children that took the course and the children that didn't. So, as important as it is to have these conversations with your kids, especially as they get older, to not touch firearms, to alert an adult when they see one, to not go looking for them, it's never enough because children are curious and they can't always remember or understand the consequences of their actions. So accidental shootings are common and they are deadly, but they are easily preventable with secure storage in the home. Now, this is obviously a difficult topic to talk about, but it's an important one because it's another thing that really affects youth, especially in the United States today, but there's a mental health crisis among all generations, not just young people. So the White House reported in January of this year that 80% of suicides by minors specifically involve guns belonging to the victim's family. And honestly, no matter the type of gun or the number of guns, firearm ownership increases the risk of firearm suicide within the home. Not only do they have the highest fatality rate of any method of suicide attempt, but over the last 10 years, the firearm suicide rate among children and teens has grown by 66%. And on the state level, for every 10% rise in household firearm ownership, the risk of youth suicide increases by 27%. Firearms are involved in half the daily cases of American suicide. So guns aren't necessarily equated with a rise in suicide attempts in a specific person, but they definitely make these attempts more likely to end someone's life. So it's really important to know how to prevent at-risk individuals from having access to your firearms. Now, domestic violence with firearms, obviously, people who live alone, it doesn't always apply to them, but it's important to know because it's not always about whether or not the abuser owns a firearm. Sometimes when a victim owns a firearm but is in a relationship with an abuser, the abuser has access to this and can use it against the victim. So this instance becomes a lot more deadly when abusers have access to firearms. In fact, abusers with access to firearms are 500% or 5 times more likely to murder their female victims. The reason I say female and the reason the next slide tends to refer to women more often is because women more often report being victims of domestic violence and they're somewhat more likely, but this applies to any and all sexes and gender identities. Anyone can be a victim of domestic violence. So obviously, again, I'm not going to read the whole slide for you, but it's clear here that intimate partner murders often involve firearms and that female murders often involve intimate partners. So there's a reciprocal relationship here. Almost 1 million women alive have had a firearm used against them by an intimate partner, and more than 4.5 million have reported having been threatened with a firearm by an intimate partner. So domestic violence definitely becomes more deadly when abusers have access to firearms. But again, if a potential victim can keep their firearms securely stored and their abuser doesn't have access to them, this eliminates that threat to them. Now, the previous slides are all really important but might not apply to someone who doesn't live with children, who lives alone, who doesn't have a history of a mental health issue, but firearm theft is a risk of firearm ownership that really applies to anyone because anyone can have their firearm stolen from them. So, almost twice the number of firearms used in instances of self-defense are stolen every year. Again, this doesn't mean you cannot use a firearm in self-defense. There are plenty of stories of firearms being used properly by responsible gun owners. But it's just to emphasize the need for secure storage, because if your gun isn't secured, it might be used against you a lot more. There might be a greater risk of it being used against you than being used for you. So in 2022, based on data reported to the FBI from 44 states, 112,000 guns were reported stolen. So the number was likely a lot higher because it was only reported thefts, and people don't always report when their guns are stolen. And guns stolen from dealers and private individuals are the third most common variety of trafficked firearms, and trafficked firearms, or illegal guns, comprise the majority of those used in firearm assaults and homicides. So a really significant aspect of firearms being stolen is when firearms are stolen from vehicles. There is an estimate, according to data reported to the FBI, that on average, 1 firearm is stolen from a car every 9 minutes in the United States. So over the course of this presentation, that would be about 5. In 2022, more than half of the guns stolen were taken from cars, most commonly cars parked at residences. So people kind of might think, oh, as long as it's on my property, it's safe, and that's just not true. And it's a really concrete example of why firearms being stored in vehicles, unless they're being transported, is not a reliable form of safe storage, is Tennessee. So in Tennessee, in 2013, Tennessee legalized the storage of firearms in parked vehicles by individuals holding handgun carry permits and expanded this to any firearm owner in 2014. Since then, gun thefts from vehicles have almost tripled and firearm homicides have increased by 85% in the state of Tennessee. So this is another deadly but avoidable instance. It's avoidable with safe storage and the elimination of as many instances of guns being in cars as possible. So the last thing I'm going to talk about is shootings committed with legal firearms. Again, this isn't always relevant, but it's really important to me, it's really important to our generation, knowing that, like, especially school shootings, a lot of them are committed not with either with legal firearms purchased by the shooter or firearms taken from the shooter's family or given to them by the shooter's family. So this really plays into the mental health aspect and the importance of checking in with people, understanding their mental situation, and knowing that at-risk individuals cannot have access to firearms. So, in a U.S. Secret Service National Threat Assessment Center analysis of 25 school shootings between 2008 and 2017, it discovered that 76% of shooters took the firearms used in their attack from a close relative's home. And the White House confirmed the statistic this year. And in almost half of these attacks, the firearms were unsecured or insignificantly secured, which allowed the shooter easy access to these weapons. So the Violence Project, with support from the National Institute of Justice, created a database of all mass shootings between 1966 and 2019. Now, according to the Congressional Research Service and the definition used by this institution, a mass shooting is defined as an event in which 4 or more people are killed, not including the shooters, without another criminal circumstance behind it. So, for example, a shooting between 2 gangs would not be considered a mass shooting because there was another criminal motivation. Now, this institution concluded that while 76% of the shooters legally purchased at least some of the firearms used in the shooting, in cases involving K-12 students, many of whom are not at the legal age when they can purchase guns, over 80% of shooters took firearms from family members. So you have to wonder what would have happened if they didn't have access to these guns. Now, obviously, I've been through a lot of depressing statistics. I've been through a lot of scary statistics on how dangerous guns can be, and the only foolproof way, yes, to stay safe is to not have a gun in your home, in terms of keeping the people in your home safe from firearms. But that's not always feasible. Some people need guns in their home, some people want to have guns in their home, and that's totally fine, because there are ways to stay safe and reduce the threat without eliminating firearms from your home. So the first and most important step is that firearm owners have to follow all legal regulations regarding the possession, use, and storage of firearms. Now, legal regulations are fairly limited between the Second Amendment and how controversial this topic has been politically in the last few years. There's not a lot of legislation being made around this issue, but there are a lot of ways that aren't technically federally or state mandated that people can secure their guns by implementing these methods. So I'm going to start by going through some New Jersey safe storage regulations. Everything I say, this is not an exhaustive list. If you have any questions, I recommend the Firearms FAQ page on the state police website. They have a lot of good information. And if you still have questions after that, please refer to the state police or the local Chatham police. They're here to answer your questions, and they are the most qualified. Now, in terms of child access prevention in New Jersey, it is illegal to store firearms in such a way, meaning that they are not secured by a trigger lock or a secure container, that they're easily accessible to someone under the age of 16. And you can be held criminally liable for a disorderly persons offense if you store your firearms in such a way and someone under the age of 16 accesses them. This is, of course, it has some exceptions. If the person under the age of 16 is legally using them, that's totally fine. And if they gain access to the firearms because of someone, them or someone else breaking into the premises, you will not be held liable for that. It is also illegal to supply firearms of any variety to someone under the age of 18 or a handgun to someone under the age of 21 with a minimum 3-year prison sentence associated with this crime. There are also a lot of vehicle storage regulations, again, which makes sense given the prevalence of vehicle theft, guns theft from vehicles, I should say. Firearms have to be stored unloaded and in a securely locked container in a vehicle kept away from the driver. So preferably that would be in the trunk. If a car doesn't have a trunk, they should be kept in the back seat. A glove box or console does not qualify as a locked container, even if it has a lock on it, because it's too close to the driver. Ammunition has to be transported in a locked container separate from firearms. And all of this applies to motorcycles, but some people have questions regarding bags. If it's a bag with a lock on it, that's totally fine. Now, the last bit of legislation I'm going to go over, or the second to last bit, I should say, is that retail firearm suppliers are legally required to include a trigger lock or secure container with every handgun that they sell, except for personalized handguns. Now, these are handguns with a permanent programmable aspect that prevents others from using the firearm, like a fingerprint ID. You won't see a lot of those because they also have to meet all under industry safety standards and be approved by the state. So it's generally safe to assume that if you're purchasing a handgun, the dealer has to include a trigger lock or secure container for free with that handgun under the Federal Child Safety Law Act of 2005. Now, trigger locks, I'm going to explain later, can pose more of a danger than you might think, given that they are a storage device, because if implemented wrong, they can cause a gun to go off when the trigger lock is placed on it. But you should never refuse taking this, because if it's used properly, it's a good way of preventing children from accessing firearms. So the last bit of legislation I'm going to go over is just the fact that assault weapons are banned within the state of New Jersey. The previously referenced New Jersey FAQ state police page lists all the assault weapons. It refers you to the specific legislation. And any firearm that is deemed substantially identical, meaning it has the same make and model, it might have a different grip material, color, etc. But if it is ruled to be substantially identical, it is likewise banned. And again, the pieces of legislation on the FAQ page explain all of the modifications that can be made that do not remove it from being under the ban. Now, moving on from New Jersey state requirements, I'm going to talk about some guidelines and recommendations made by the government and just found by me throughout my own research. So recently the Department of Justice issued a guide for storing firearms. This is not a federal mandate at all, but it is federal suggestions based off research. So the Department of Justice recommends that you store all your firearms unloaded in a locked container and separate from ammunition, inaccessible to children. Removing firearms from storage should be a careful process. You should check that they remain unlocked. It might sound stupid if you know, unloaded, excuse me. It might sound dumb if you know you're the last one to put it in there, but it's just so important. So just aim the gun away from any other individual so that if it were to go off, it wouldn't hurt anyone, and double check that the chamber remains empty. Now, the DOJ also explains that zip ties, rope, string, closets, drawers, and cabinets do not meet the definition of a secure storage device, which makes sense given the statistics we heard earlier about accidental shootings and children gaining access to cabinets. The DOJ also has some recommendations regarding the individuals within the home and at-risk individuals. So secure storage is two parts really. It's the physical storage and it's the decision of who has access to firearms. So if you live with an individual who's at risk to harm themselves or others, you should consider out-of-home storage with a federal firearms licensee. When they follow all regulations, local, state, and federal, they are great resources for help with your firearms. If you don't want to store out of home, that's fine, but you should certainly remove all keys and codes from the possession of at-risk individuals, and if they are programmed to have access to a gun safe with a biometric lock, you should remove that identification from allowing them to have access. Now, you should also familiarize yourself with the warning signs of someone who's at risk. So someone who has had a recently negatively impactful life event, like the loss of a job, someone who feels hopeless or feels as though they are a burden and has expressed these feelings, someone who has expressed violent or reckless behavior. These are all examples of someone who shouldn't have access to firearms. And an extreme risk protective order is a route you can take to prevent someone from having access to their own firearms if you feel that they are at risk to harm themselves or others. So this is an order that can be taken out by a family member, which is defined on the New Jersey ERPO page, or a law enforcement agency, and basically temporarily removes all firearms and licenses from the possession of someone who is deemed to be at risk by the court. These can be reversed by the recipient or the person who took out the order, as long as there's proof presented to the court that they are no longer a risk. There are also individuals who are prohibited from owning, operating, or possessing firearms, such as felons, anyone convicted of a domestic violence offense, misdemeanor, felony, or just subjected to a restraining order, someone who has immigrated illegally or renounced citizenship. These are the type of people that, even if you own a gun legally, are not allowed to have access to your firearm. So I've talked about the regulations and the risks and everything you have to do, and now I'm going to talk about how you can do it. So one option for firearm storage is disassembling your firearm. While this is a great way to prevent people from accessing it because it's in different pieces, ideally locked away, it's not always practical, especially if you're planning to use your firearm for self-defense. You would have to locate all the pieces and assemble them. So also, someone who doesn't know how to properly disassemble their firearm shouldn't try it at all because it could lead to worse problems. So another option that's more feasible for most people is a lockbox. This prevents unauthorized access to firearms by locking up your firearms. Combinations and keys must be kept separate from the box and separate from children. The only problem with a lockbox is that because they are designed to be portable, it's relatively easy to steal one because the thief doesn't have to steal the gun from the box. They just have to take the box with them and break into it later. So that's the only real downside to a lockbox. But their transportability is what makes it great if you need to move a firearm from your home to the range or from the range to somewhere else. So the best secure storage device for in-home permanent storage of a firearm is a gun safe. These prevent unauthorized access and hinder theft because they are heavy and they can be secured to your home structure. These can also have a biometric, which is like a fingerprint, combination or key lock, and I would recommend biometric because it offers the quickest access for authorized users, but any of these are totally fine. These are not to be confused with gun cabinets. Gun cabinets are made of wood or thin metal and do not offer anything in terms of advanced security. Those are display cases. They're not secure storage. A gun safe is the best form of secure storage. But something is always better than nothing. So if all someone can do is institute a trigger lock or a cable lock, whatever you can do to secure your firearms is what you should do. Anything that's easiest. So in terms of gun safe, there's a couple things to look for. I'll just name a couple of them. Fire resistance. If a gun safe doesn't have at least an hour's worth of fire resistance, it probably shouldn't be purchased because when your ammunition is exposed to firearm, not only can your guns be damaged, but it can actually go off. Gun safe should be made of thick steel. At least a year warranty indicates that the company has good faith in their product. And if it's not rated UL, if it doesn't have a UL RSC, Residential Security Container rating, it probably shouldn't be purchased because it means it hasn't been tested by a reliable third party. Now, as I mentioned before, lockboxes are great for transporting firearms to and from your home, storage, the range, etc. You can secure some of them to a vehicle, but this isn't always possible. And under New Jersey law, they cannot be in the glove box or center console and must be kept away from the driver if they're in the passenger area rather than the trunk. Now, there's a few other safety measures that I like to call secondary measures, as in these shouldn't, in an ideal world, these aren't the primary method of securing your firearms, but they're great methods of reducing the risks associated with firearm ownership. So, cable locks, when instituted, can be used to prevent the action of a gun from closing, so they actually prevent it from being fired. And they're a great way of keeping children away from your firearms. Again, a thief with bolt cutters and 5 minutes of time will probably get into it, but if you're worried about your kids, this is a great way. It's better than a trigger lock because trigger locks don't prevent the gun from being fired, and if they're put on the gun, especially in the wrong way, they can actually fire a loaded gun. So trigger locks can be used, but you have to be really, really careful that a gun is not loaded when a trigger lock is placed on it. So that's why they're not listed here as a secondary safety measure. Another important aspect of firearm ownership is mental health, keeping up with your own mental health and those of the people around you who have access to firearms. The National Association of Mental Illness, or NAMI, has a chapter in New Brunswick and an online website that can refer you to helplines and mental health screenings if you feel the need to be checked. And the last, arguably one of the most important measures associated with gun ownership is training. I believe we can all understand why training is important when you own a gun, but if there's any doubt, there was a study done by the, by the National Gun Victims Action Council and members of Mount St. Mary's University, where people in a firearms simulator were studied, some who had undergone training and some who had not, and those that underwent less training performed significantly worse. At times they shot innocent bystanders who were unarmed. So the NRA offers multiple safety courses in terms of training for guns, and there's a lot of different levels depending on your need. And there's a Flemington, New Jersey Tactical Training Center that offers a bunch of different firearm safety courses, all coordinated by current or former members of state police with firearms instructor certifications. So, in summary, there are 4 big things to do to keep yourself and your loved ones safe when firearms are in the home. Store your firearms unloaded, store them locked, store your ammunition separate, and lock up your ammunition as well. And there's a 5th thing that kind of applies to all of these, which is that any keys and combinations should be kept separate from the containers and only accessible to authorized individuals. So these are some of the helpful resources I've found that I consolidated into one page, but in my bibliography I mentioned all the resources I used. If you'd like, I can share this presentation with you. I can send you a link so you can view it, and refer to any of the links at any time. They're great resources for answering any of your questions and providing information. So if you'd like, just come up to me after, give me your email, and I can send you the presentation so you can refer back to it, because I know it was a lot of information. These are the rest of my links. As you can tell, a lot went into this. But I want to thank you all so much for coming, and I really appreciate it. So thank you.